Hey Enneagram friends, I'm Abby, an IA accredited Enneagram teacher and certified somatic practitioner. My work has always been an invitation for greater self-awareness and really a compassionate curiosity for the world. And I offer that invitation through corporate Enneagram workshops, private coaching, and educational resources like this podcast. In this season of the podcast, I'm inviting fellow Enneagram teachers, authors, and practitioners into the podcast space to share with you about personal growth, all through the lens of their personal type structure. Today on the podcast, I share a conversation with Amanda Clegg about her personal growth and discovery as an Enneagram Four. So let me share with you just a little bit about Amanda's work before I invite you into the conversation. Amanda is a relationship coach and also an Enneagram practitioner trained through the narrative tradition, which is the same program that I went through. So that's where we met. She works with individuals, couples, and businesses, helping them foster relationships within themselves as well as with others. Her devotion to this work comes from her personal experiences and her healing journey. She shares that with a history of trauma, addiction, and mental health struggles, Amanda feels really blessed to be able to serve others in a meaningful way. Her approach is firmly rooted in the belief that she needs to be her own best client. And so although she's a teacher, she is first and foremost a lifelong student. So friends, I am excited to share this episode with you and invite you into this conversation with Amanda, all about her experience and personal growth through the lens of type 4. So I hope that you'll listen in with curiosity and compassion as she shares her experience. Well, thank you, Amanda, for being here. Thanks for saying yes to the conversation and allowing us to explore your personal growth through the lens of type 4. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So, when I met you years ago, I met you in a fellow type 8 group panel processing space. But then when I reached out to you, you luckily informed me that that's not where you land on the diagram anymore. So let's just start there of, your process of landing on type 4 and what that's looking like for you.
Yeah. Wow. It was a big shift for me. When I first learned about the Enneagram, I took an online test, as a lot of people do. And you and I both learned in our training how important the typing process is. I would say to go through with a qualified professional because mistyping is so common. So I took an online test, got type 8. And when I read about 8, it felt a lot like me. And it was almost like a puzzle where a lot of the pieces fit, but maybe I was doing 2 puzzles at once. So the pieces weren't quite aligned. And I feel like part of how I could have told that I wasn't an 8 was by how excited I got about the growth process. I feel like when you land in your type, it stings a bit and it makes you see things that you don't want to see. And when I learned about the 8 in hindsight, I was excited. I get to be vulnerable. I get to show my emotions. I get to surrender. And I was excited about that. And I mean, we know the difference between the path of growth for an 8 and a 4. And for a 4, it's a lot more emotional regulation, emotional balance, maybe not oversharing your vulnerability, right? So I was in type 8 for a few years, maybe 4.5 years. And in that time, I was actually working with a provider who told me to look at type 3. So I was bouncing between 8 and 3, a lot fit for both. And then I was listening to a audiobook by Russ Hudson, and I was in the shower, and I went to skip over type 4. I think I had some unconscious resistance to 4. I went to skip over it, but my hands were too wet. I was like, I'll just listen. And he starts talking, and I just had this epiphany moment in my body where I was like, oh, dang. How did I miss that? And it was, typical 4 fashion for me, I guess. It was emotional realizing that I was a 4 because they were the type that I least understood. And it's funny because over the years, I would joke with my colleagues, like, why do so many 4s keep wanting to work with me? They were just that was the most type that I was getting. And I think it was the universe's way of knocking on my door of, hey, maybe take a look at this. So yeah, it took me a good 4.5 years to land in type 4. And it was painful for me, physically and emotionally painful to see those unconscious parts of myself that I didn't want to see. And now I'm very much in this place of gratitude for it and the growth that I've seen in such a short amount of time. So this happened last December, early January. The growth that I've seen in myself and the freedom that I feel in who I am, those 4 years as an 8 never gave me that. Right.
Yeah.
It's almost like it got me to a certain place. I was still doing inner work, but now it's kind of like the floodgates opened and I know who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels really, really beautiful to say.
Yeah. There's so many good things that you've shared in there, but I wanna rewind a little bit to one of the pieces that you had you talked about it being like emotionally and physically painful to have it's almost like the scales drawn, like drawn off, the curtains unveiled, and realizing like, oh, these are the pieces, right? I'm curious if you're willing to share what were some of those the pieces that were illuminated in that process. Maybe the light was shown on some of those shadow pieces, and that early conversation around the 4 that felt most illuminating, or maybe even you had most resistance to.
Great question. There's a lot in that. I think for me, part of why I always thought I was a body type was because of how much I somatically experience my emotions. And that was very much the response that I had when I realized that I was a 4. And I think I was really scared because all of the type structure felt like truth. So it was almost like I was blind to see the path of growth or the possibilities as a 4. Not to sound dramatic, but I was like, this is a death sentence. I don't want this. And I didn't see a way out and that's the language I use with my clients a lot of like, our type structure feels like truth. And it can be challenging to see that that's not who we are. And I think just in that moment, it was just overwhelming to realize that throughout my life, I've misunderstood me too. So the habit of mind, like the melancholy, I didn't know how to get out of that. And the envy, the driving emotion, I didn't know how to get out of that. And even though the Enneagram identifies the antidotes to everything, it wasn't clicking for me, where for every single other type, it's like I could tell exactly what they could do. And for myself, I didn't know how. And I was also going through a really painful season of my life during that point as well. So everything felt really heavy. There was a lot of grief.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you very beautifully articulated that moment of realizing like this is my type structure, not just me, right? Not that it's not part of you, right? It is part of you, but it is your type. And I think these moments of like, if I am not that, then what am I, right? If this is not all of me, if this is not my authentic self, and I took this away, what is left? And there's a lot of like grief and fear in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Luckily, during that point in my life, I had some really close friends that were super supportive. A little bit shocked when I shared the news that they're very into the Enneagram as well. And they would send me the higher qualities of the 4 and kind of outline ways that they already see that in me. So that was really grounding and cool to connect to. And then over time, over the months and going deeper, things just started to click into place for me. And I started to be able to embody some of those things. And now I'm always learning and always growing and will always have my type structure, but it feels really awesome to say that I've connected to some of those qualities, and I'm really proud of being a 4.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Shout out from about it.
Yeah.
So, as you kind of talk through some of the pieces as you started to see them, of like, I see the melancholy, but I don't know how to get out of it. I see the envy, but I don't know how to get out of it. I'd love to kind of revisit some of those pieces and what were the practices, the inner work, maybe the mentality that you took on to help manage or balance out the reactivity of your type in some of those areas. So maybe even starting with that, the melancholy, or maybe sometimes people even described it as like the quick shifting between emotions or between even sensations of how you're feeling things. So what did it look like for you to kind of balance out that reactivity in your type structure?
Yeah, the first and most important piece of that was the awareness around it. So part of why I never thought I was a four was because my emotions my whole life have been normal to me. I didn't realize that they were so drastic or that they shifted so much throughout the day. So before I get out of bed in the morning, or at least at that point, I could go through 10 to 15 emotions, and that just felt normal. I didn't look through the lens of, oh, most people don't experience that. That's a very wide range, a wide spectrum of feelings. So just being able to kind of step back and get into that inner observer place to watch myself in action through that four lens was so, so helpful, because through the eight, I'm like, look at me go, feeling all my feelings. Yeah. And through the four lens, I'm like, whoa, girl, there's a lot going on here. Let's meet that. So the awareness around it, and noticing, I think one of the most helpful things actually was learning about the head heart loop. So an emotion shows up for me in my heart, and then I go to my head and I create a story. And that story is usually melancholic in nature. And then that story creates another feeling, which creates another story. And then I get stuck in this cycle. So seeing that and being able to disconnect emotionally from it was life-changing for me, and allowed me to like really lovingly challenge these feelings and these stories and stop them in their tracks and get into my body. So actually learning to drop in somatically, find a new truth, and moving forward in that was one of the biggest things that I practiced every single day. And another piece too, I mean, it's still working with the Enneagram, but I really I did a lot of inner child work and will continue to do that. And I really reconnected to the parts of myself that I love. I feel like in my life, I lost a lot of who I was, and I didn't have consistent practices or hobbies or just things that brought me joy. So I started doing pottery. I started skateboarding. I started dirt biking. Picked up snowboarding again, just all these things that made me feel like me and made me feel really whole and brought a lot of pleasure into my life, really helped balance out everything else. And then when I did that, I started meeting people who I really aligned with. So it helped with a lot of the stories of, I don't belong. Nobody wants me here. I need to force things to make them fit. And instead, when I showed up just as Amanda, these people came into my life that loved me for me and wanted to know that. So by focusing on healing in other ways, not necessarily through the like, I'll say more logical inner work, it just brought me a lot of that equanimity of a four, of feeling really balanced and integrated and whole.
Yeah. And now, even as you're talking through some of those pieces, I'm struck by how many of those, hobbies, for lack of a better term, they're all very action oriented, right? Like you're physically doing something. And I think sometimes that somatic piece, it doesn't have to be that you're like, sitting in child's pose or whatever, right? It doesn't have to be that stereotypical somatic piece. It can be just physically doing something rather than like sitting in the sensation or sitting in the emotion of it.
That is such a good point that I had not connected to. All of it. Yeah, even the pottery, like getting in my body, using my hands. Whoa. Thank you for that.
Yeah. The other piece that I would love to revisit back, you talked about just kind of this piece of envy. And I know that you already said, this invited you into this invitation of equanimity, that there's kind of this plumb line in between the highs and the lows, that sometimes propel that sense of envy, that sense of longing, that something is missing. But I'd love to hear more about that piece of envy, how you started to notice it once you kind of landed on type 4, and what were some practices around that to balance it out.
Yeah, envy is a big one. I think it's something that I didn't want to admit that I experienced. And that's part of leading with the sexual subtype too, like being very competitive. But it showed up as a lot of hopelessness, this very emotional response of everybody else has what I want and I can't get it. And very much this like victim place. I remember actually there was a couple people in particular when I was landing in type 4 who I follow on social media, and the things that they would post would send me into a spiral. And it could be simple things like they posted doing pottery, they posted playing pool. But it was so painful for me to see that and feel like I couldn't have it. And it feels a little bit silly to say, but I remember in those moments it felt so real. And like, it's not possible for me. I'm not going to meet people to do that with. I'm not going to be able to have those opportunities. And that's where the action piece came in, where I noticed the story. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Found a pottery class, started playing pool, right? Just putting myself out there. And then for me, it's just wild to see how easily I could get stuck in the envy and feel like there was no way out. And just this constant envy shows up as like this constant comparison of like, how do I measure up to people? And it sucks. It sucks not just for me, but comparing myself to other people, it creates disconnection. And I don't want that. So I've really learned to like honor other people's lives and strengths. And when I see it now, I feel inspiration behind it. And that's a huge shift. So now when I see something that used to trigger my nervous system, now it's actually a positive response on my nervous system where I'm like so stoked for that person. And that information is showing me what I want in my life. Right. So an example could be like, I see someone skateboarding and doing something incredible, where before I'd be like, oh, I'm just going to give up. Why even try? And now I'm like, holy, look at them go. I'm going to try that too. So it's this empowerment on both sides. And yeah, to move from envy to inspiration somatically feels so nice. It feels so good. So that's the practice for me. And in the beginning, it looked a lot like noticing the envy and consciously connecting to inspiration. And now over time and repeated patterns, it's become more natural. So the automatic was very much the envy, and the natural response is that inspiration, but it took time and a lot of intentionality to get there. It didn't just happen overnight. And in the beginning, it didn't feel real, but I just stuck with it. It's like, I want this to feel real. And channeling what I want or wanted allowed me to connect to that.
Yeah. When you say some of that initial choosing to connect, and even that sensation of it not feeling real, is it in those moments noticing that you're triggered by something, there's envy showing up, and then mentally like a mantra of choosing inspiration, or were there some other somatic practices or breath work or things that showed up in that intention to be inspired instead of envious?
Yeah, great question. So mentally, it's noticing it first and just, again, seeing that story. And I have such a somatic response to things too. It's almost like when I would notice that trigger, I could feel the visuals like a child having a temper tantrum, like, oh, inside my body, just this intensity. So seeing that and really doing some self-compassion practices. So simple ones like hand on the heart, breathing in and down, noticing, pausing, allowing, and connecting to that part of me that feels triggered. And that looked a lot like, how old is this part? Okay, she's 12. What's the story that little Amanda learned at 12 years old? How is that showing up right now? How can I come in and be in relationship with her? So a lot of that visual practice of connecting to these deeper parts of me that were wounded and integrating that way. Yeah. So yeah, noticing it mentally first, checking in to see how it's in my body, and just really seeing the stories and where they came from.
Yeah. And it's amazing.
Oh, and I'll add to that too.
Yeah.
I have a lot of photos of my younger selves at different ages, and I'll pull them out when I need them. So I do have that visual practice too to connect to. And that's an
Yeah.
important piece.
No, that's great. Well, and I think even, you know, when you talk through it, it is amazing. And even as I've talked through different facets with many practitioners in this season, it's amazing how much just bringing awareness to things can help alleviate that instant, like, reaction of, I have to get out of here, I have to fix this, or this is not okay, or this is all is lost and all is hopeless. And I think sometimes that feels, for someone that's listening to the podcast, or even when they come into a coaching space, it feels like not enough when you say, like, it starts with awareness, and it feels like, no, like, I want the hard stuff, like, I want the, like, fix it now stuff. And then I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
well, then the second part is compassion, actually. So, like, let's start with awareness, and then let's go into compassion. And I think we get into these spaces where we just want to, like, white knuckle our type and just make things stop or get through them. And the reality is, it's often the invitation to soften and to bring some awareness to it, to breathe so that
Yeah.
we can face it while our nervous system might be freaking out a little bit in that parasympathetic nervous system. But then to just be kind. Like, even I love that you offered as a practice, holding your hands on that heart space and just some, like, self-soothing touch. It's
Yep.
amazing how much we can help balance out our nervous system when, it's triggered by things that either feel obvious, and sometimes things that don't feel obvious. You may check in and there's not really a story there, or there's nothing that feels, overtly alarming about what you're witnessing, but something was picked up in your nervous system. And so just still being kind to your body, as those things come up and as you're sensing them in the field.
Really, I also feel like as a four, playfulness is such a huge part of my healing. So even as you're talking, I'm just like, ride the wave, baby. It's going to come up. Just ride the wave. So when I notice that, bringing that playful energy into something that's really painful and overwhelming and triggering is really, really healing for me. And that's very much the energy that I had when I was a kid, right? I presented a lot, like, just for visual, like a lot like a 7. And my natural energy is more in that playful, positive, happy, silly, weird. So that bringing that playfulness into the seriousness of my healing has been one of the most positive things I could have done for myself and will continue to do. So ride the wave, baby.
Well, and I think some of it, it's almost this invitation for, like, levity, that, like, silliness, playfulness, but also of, like, I think the invitation to not try to get to the bottom of everything with such seriousness, and there being such a weight and gravity to every emotion as it arises, or every thought or story, and to let there be some levity, right? Like, it can't always be that, but inviting that in at times, to, I don't know, to have some levity in the space too, so that it's not always pondering and ruminating and trying to sort through, because sometimes it can just come and go and not mean much of anything.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I feel like it is a mix of both. It's a balance of both, but especially as a 4, knowing, oh, I don't need to fully dissect all this. I don't need to deeply, deeply understand. I can just ride that wave, let it pass, and move on. I can let it go. Ooh, being able to let things go. That's huge. Before, I was trying to work on, like, letting it be through the 8 lens. But now it's just like, I can let things go. I don't have to hold on to every painful thing that I've ever experienced. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think even you're, like, just touching on that note of, like, that interjection of where things just become absorbed and they become, like, part of identity. And I think for people that don't lead with type 4, it feels hard to understand it because they don't even deal with it. So it's like, how would you not want to let it go? Like, I can't even deal with it, right? Like, I can't even name it, let alone, like, I'd never let it come to begin with, let alone want to keep it to stay. But right, it's just this piece of, like, if I own it and I absorb it, then it's mine and I can control it. But then it still is controlling you too.
Yeah. Yeah. Learning to be a Teflon pan.
Mhm.
I'm gonna slide right off.
Oh, I love that. So, I know that these pieces are always evolving. You're always a 4. There will always be new seasons and people that come in and out of your life that trigger different parts of your type structure in a new way, even in ways that you feel like you've had a lot of balance and a lot of growth and grace with them. But I'm curious, in this current season, what are the aspects of your type structure that maybe that you're mindful of because they keep surfacing, or maybe even the practices that are your consistent rhythm and some of that inner work that feels like a part of the everyday present now?
I think very much at the forefront right now is using the personal for the universal. That's something that never quite made sense to me. And when I reflect on my life and the experiences that I've had, how I've worked through them, I notice I get clients who come in who've experienced a lot of the same. That's not to say their path of growth is the same. That's not to say that I share my experience. I use a lot of clinical discernment in what I do and don't share with clients, and always want to make sure it's a positive intervention. But I have noticed that my experiences, my personal experiences, speak to the collective.
Mm.
So I feel like I'm looking through that lens very much in this season of my life of how can I use my story to help others? And that feels really authentic too. So even what I share on social media, now it's more personal. And I would say that's one of my biggest practices right now. Um, mm, I'm trying to think what else that's the biggest thing. I'm doing a lot of work around um, healing my attachment wounds too,
Mm.
through attachment theory, but through that Enneagram too, and just seeing the ways that I wanted to be loved so badly that I gave up my needs, wants, desires, and would lose myself in relationships.
Mm.
So I'm dating now. I'm learning a lot about myself in that process. And it's pretty powerful just to have the awareness that I do now. I mean, when last time I dated was 6 years ago, and my life has changed a lot since then. So seeing how my type 4 patterns show up and working with them in real time is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Mm. I love that.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, even just thinking about that piece of coming into type 4 with so much awareness of what that is, rather than someone like handing you, "Hey, you're type 4, go figure it out." It was almost like you knew what that was, and then you realize like, "Oh, this is actually where I land." But what a gift that is. I think sometimes it's like, here's the starting line, here's your type, and it was like you already actually knew the whole race. You just didn't know this is where you were starting in that process. And so just what a like, I think sometimes when people land on different types and it takes a time, it takes a while to figure it out, it feels like they're wandering around. And the reality is like, it's all just part of the journey. It's, we're all getting there. And sometimes it's a lot of loop-de-loops and sometimes it's a straight path, but that feels like a gift,
Yeah.
even hearing you talk about your current context of like, and now I know these pieces. And so this is what's showing up and this is what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
So I know that we could talk a long time, and also we only talk about one type. We could talk about all the numbers, but I do want to give you some space just to share how people can be connected to your work. What it is that you do as a practitioner, why they might find you, and then what's easy ways for them to get connected to you.
Yeah. So I work with individuals and couples on a daily basis, and I connect with businesses a couple times a year. I do love working with them, and often there it's typing interviews, workshops, but my heart at this season in my life is really in the individual and couple space. And the language that I use and what I put at the forefront is very much relationship coaching. So I want to help my clients build a secure relationship with themselves and with other people in their life. And my work focuses a lot on what you mentioned earlier around self compassion. It's such a huge part of being able to build that within ourselves. And I do a lot of attachment theory work as well. So blending that with the Enneagram. And yeah, so I work I have my own practice, and I also work at a practice in Maryland. So if anyone's in Maryland and wants to connect with me through there, I can provide the information for that as well. It's been really cool as a relationship coach to have my own practice, but also be able to connect with another one and have colleagues and have supervision and be able to process cases together and have that support. It's been pretty life-changing for me. And yeah, on my Instagram, there's some changes happening right now that I'm really excited about. I'm kind of just like finding my new groove, especially since landing in type 4 of what I want to share. Getting much more, like a teaser. There's some there's some new pathways that I'm exploring in my professional career that's leading to a lot of work around sexual healing and intimacy and connection. So some changes happening there. I love supporting couples in the intimacy space and building that very nourishing relationship with sex.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay. Well, I love that. Thanks for the teaser. You heard it here first. Okay. Well, and I will link all those pieces in the show notes so that people can find you and can connect with your work. So thank you for saying yes. Thanks for being on the podcast. It feels, again, like such a gift to get to hear not just about type 4, but to get to hear what your life is like as you land in the type structure and some of the growing edges. And I think like it's a gift to also hear it articulated so well as someone that's a Enneagram teacher. Not that the average Joe couldn't talk about their type, but it feels like a gift to get to hear someone that is very well versed in type structure talk about it in a very, honest way. So thank you for offering that gift.
Thank you so much. It feels really good to just be able to show up as me and share that fully and have it be received with so much love and care. So I appreciate you.
Hey, Enneagram friends. Thanks for listening into my conversation with Amanda. I hope that you experienced this episode and this conversation as a gift just as much as I did. If you found this episode helpful, would you do me a favor and share it with a friend and subscribe to the podcast so that you could hear the rest of the episodes this season? That's a great way to share this resource and to grow the community and the conversations around the Enneagram. Okay, friends, until next time.